She pressed the cold, matte black barrel against the back of his skull while he slept, the metal a freezing contrast to the sweltering heat that still clung to the fabric of the tent. Danny Rohr never opened his eyes. He didn't even shift in his sleep. There was no dramatic awakening, no frantic struggle for life, no final words whispered into the dark. There was only the heavy, rhythmic sound of his breathing, which stopped the very instant she pulled the trigger. One muffled thud. The desert, vast and indifferent, swallowed every vibration of the shot before it could reach the ears of the sentries at the perimeter. The weapon she used was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, a tool that defied the standard laws of ballistics known to the men in this camp. She began the disassembly process immediately, her fingers moving with a fluidity that suggested she could do this blindfolded, underwater, or in the middle of a hurricane. 90 seconds. That was all it took to break the weapon down into its constituent parts, each piece small enough to be overlooked. She slid the firing pin, the custom-machined barrel, and the suppressed housing back into her medical kit, nesting them deep between rolls of sterile gauze and vials of morphine. She zipped the bag, smoothed her hair, and walked calmly across the camp under the pale light of a moon that looked like a jagged bone in the sky. When the screaming started 4 minutes later, Maya Collins was already kneeling beside the body she had just created. She had her gloves on, her face a mask of practiced professional urgency. She was performing chest compressions on a man whose heart she had stopped herself, her palms rhythmically striking a chest that would never rise again. No one questioned the medic. No one ever does. In the chaos of a dying man, the person trying to save him is the only one above suspicion. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee, unwashed bodies, and industrial-grade air conditioning. A sharp, chemical scent that was the military's way of pretending a converted shipping container in the middle of a desolate wasteland could pass for a legitimate command post. Captain Ryan Keller stood at the front of the narrow room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had the expression of a man who had already decided how this mission would end long before anyone else had even finished reading the classified files on their tablets. He looked at the 12 men and 1 woman gathered before him, his eyes hard and sunken from a lack of sleep that seemed to span months rather than days. 43 confirmed kills, he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated against the corrugated metal walls. 0 confirmed shooter positions, 0 shell casings recovered from any scene, 0 drone intercepts, and 0 explanations from anyone above my pay grade. He let that information hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a statistical impossibility in the world of modern warfare. Every round leaves a signature. Every shooter leaves a footprint. But in this sector of the desert, the laws of physics seem to have been suspended. Sergeant Dale Apprentice leaned forward in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight. He was a man built like a brick wall, with a face mapped by scars and a skepticism that ran deeper than his marrow. He didn't need words to communicate his disdain for the situation, but he offered them anyway. 0 shells, he repeated, the words tasting like ash. That's not possible, Captain. Every weapon ejects. Every round leaves a signature in the dirt, a heat trail for the thermals, something. You're telling us we're hunting a ghost that doesn't use gravity? Keller's jaw tightened, a small muscle pulsing in his cheek. I know what every weapon does, Sergeant. And if you know that, then you know this doesn't make any sense. Which is exactly why we're here. We are here to make it make sense. We are here to find the variable we're missing and kill it before it kills us. The room held a cross-section of the best the military had to offer, yet they all looked like they were waiting for a blow to land from a direction they couldn't see. These were men who had been in enough high-stakes, life-or-death situations to develop a professional tolerance for fear. But this was different. This wasn't a tactical problem, it was a psychological one. They sat in varying postures of forced attention. Some leaned back, trying to project a casual indifference they didn't feel. Others leaned forward, their eyes locked on the satellite maps as if they could find a hidden door in the pixels. Some, like Keller, kept their arms crossed, mirroring his certainty because certainty was a currency you traded in on a deployment like this. You did not show up to a ghost story believing in ghosts. You showed up believing in angles, trajectories, human error, and enemy incompetence. If you admitted even for a second that the enemy was playing by a different set of rules, you were already dead. Maya Collins sat at the end of the row nearest the door, her position chosen with the same care she applied to everything else. She had her field notebook open on her knee, her pen moving in slow, steady strokes as Keller spoke. If you had glanced at her in that moment, you would have seen a dedicated medic taking meticulous notes on potential casualty patterns. You would have noted her quietness, her slightly downcast eyes, and the way she seemed to shrink into the background, a total absence of the posturing and bravado that the rest of the room performed naturally. You would not have looked twice. That was the point. Her entire existence was built on the foundation of being the person. No one remembers being in the room. The operating theory from Division, Keller continued, pulling up a grainy satellite image on the wall-mounted screen that flickered with static, is that we're dealing with either a highly skilled indigenous combatant using improvised long-range equipment, or, and I want to be clear that I find this less likely, a foreign-trained asset operating with advanced suppression technology. He pointed to a cluster of red dots on the map, each representing a life snuffed out in total silence. Advanced suppression, said Corporal James Whitfield, a compact man with a voice that always sounded slightly offended, as if the world's refusal to be simple was a personal slight against him. What does that mean exactly? Because if there's a weapon system out there that leaves no acoustic signature and no thermal trace, that's not just a tactical problem. That's a physics problem. We're talking about something that shouldn't exist. It means, Keller said, his voice dripping with the forced patience of a man explaining the alphabet to a child for the 14th time, that we don't know yet. Our job is to find out. We are the scouts. We are the bait. Private Marcus Hale remained silent. At 26 years old, he was the youngest person in the room by 4 years, a gap that felt like a century in a place like this. He had learned early in his first deployment that the best strategy in a high-level briefing was to listen more than you spoke and to watch the people rather than the maps. Marcus possessed a particular kind of intelligence that manifested as observation rather than commentary. He noticed the small things that others missed in their rush to find the big answers. He saw the way Sergeant Apprentice's jaw moved when he was deciding whether to argue or obey. He saw the way Keller's hand instinctively went to his belt buckle when he was less certain than he sounded, a nervous tick hidden in plain sight. And he saw the way Maya Collins's pen stopped moving for exactly 3 seconds when Keller uttered the phrase indigenous combatant. It was just 3 seconds, a heartbeat, a pause for breath, and then it started again, her pen resuming its steady crawl across the paper. Marcus filed it away in the back of his mind, a tiny fragment of data that didn't fit, though he didn't yet know why. The unit was designated Alpha 7. They were a Frankenstein's monster of a team, assembled from different battalions with the specific intention of creating a group that had no prior shared experience. The command wanted no established blind spots, no ingrained assumptions about how desert engagements worked, and no friendships that might cloud professional judgment. Keller had requested this specific assignment, arguing for it in a memo that Marcus would only discover much later. In that memo, the language Keller used would strike Marcus as almost prophetically self-condemning. "We need people who will look where others have stopped looking," Keller had written with a flourish of tactical arrogance. He had no idea how right he was, or just how horrifying the direction of that looking would eventually become. The camp itself was a FOBA, a forward operating base established 3 weeks prior by an advanced team that had since been rotated out. It was a bleak, dusty footprint covering roughly 2 acres of flat desert hard pan, surrounded by a 6-foot security fence topped with razor wire that sang in the wind. The perimeter was a high-tech fortress, monitored by 4 drone units running overlapping 12-hour cycles. There were motion sensors buried in the sand, thermal imaging cameras that could spot a rabbit at half a mile, and 2 manned observation posts at the north and south ends. By every measurable standard of modern warfare, the camp was secure. It was a bubble of safety in a sea of hostile sand. Yet, 43 men had died in similarly secure locations over the last few months. The bubble was an illusion. On the first night of their deployment, the unit completed a perimeter check with clinical efficiency. They ran communication tests with Division, 8 rations that everyone pretended were acceptable, and settled into the grueling rhythm of rotating 4-hour watch shifts. Keller took the first watch himself, a gesture of leadership that Marcus noted immediately. It was the kind of move a commander made when he wanted his team to trust him, to see that he was willing to bleed and sweat alongside them. It worked. The men relaxed just a fraction. Maya took the second watch, her presence at the transition point quiet and unobtrusive. When Marcus passed her to take his own post, she handed him a cup of instant coffee she had already prepared. The northeastern sensor tripped 3 times between midnight and 1, she told him, her voice low and steady. Pattern suggests it's just the wind kicking up debris against the fence. Probably nothing, but I wanted you to know. He thanked her, drank the bitter coffee, and thought nothing of it. He watched the desert through his night vision goggles, seeing only the green-tinted ghosts of heat rising from the stones. The first death came on the second morning, shattering the fragile peace of the camp. Specialist Danny Rohr was 29 years old, a man from Pensacola, Florida, who had a habit of waking up before his alarm. It was a quirk his bunkmates found either admirable or deeply irritating, depending on how much sleep they had managed to catch. Rohr had been outside for less than 10 minutes, standing just past the southeastern corner of the perimeter near the fuel storage tanks when it happened. The sound was not a gunshot. That was the first detail Marcus's brain registered when he came running with the rest of the team, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had heard thousands of gunshots in his career. He knew their acoustic signature, the specific violent crack and echo that announced a high-velocity round. This was a dull, heavy thud, like a book hitting a carpeted floor. They found Rohr face down in the dirt, his body strangely limp. There was a small, neat exit wound in the front of his skull that defied logic. Based on where he was standing and the proximity of the fuel tanks, there was no angle available to an external shooter that wouldn't have been caught by the sensors or the drones. "Entry point is here," said the medical officer from Division, a man named Caldwell who had been attached to the unit specifically to analyze these anomalies. Caldwell was a thin, skeletal man who spoke in the emotionless register of someone who had long ago decided that professional detachment was his only defense against madness. Clean, minimal cavitation, high velocity, small caliber, Caldwell noted, his fingers tracing the wound with a terrifying lack of hesitation. The round fragmented on exit, which explains the wound pattern, but it makes trajectory analysis almost impossible. Almost Keller snapped, his face pale with a mixture of anger and burgeoning fear. Almost Caldwell confirmed, looking up from the body. Keller looked at the fence line, then at the drone feeds playing on a handheld monitor, then at the thermal imaging reports from the last 12 hours. He looked in every direction except the one that actually mattered. External shooter, Keller finally declared, though it sounded more like a prayer than a tactical assessment. Suppressed weapon. Advanced fragmentation rounds. They're watching our patterns. They're waiting for us to blink. We just got here, Sergeant Apprentice said quietly, his voice thick with a growing dread. They couldn't have our patterns already. It's been less than 48 hours. Keller didn't look at him. They've been watching this position for weeks before we arrived, he countered. They knew exactly where Rohr would stand. Apprentice didn't argue, but the look on his face suggested he wasn't buying the story Keller was selling. Maya Collins had been the first to reach the body. She had come from the direction of the medical tent, which was located on the exact opposite side of the camp. She had her kit open within 40 seconds of the first shout, already running through the motions of an emergency response that everyone in the unit knew was futile. Rohr was gone before his knees hit the sand. Later, Caldwell would note in his official report that the medic's response time had been exceptional, a testament to her training. He didn't ask why she had been moving toward the southeastern corner of the camp before the body was even discovered. It was a small inconsistency, the kind of minor detail that gets lost in the noise of grief, the urgency of a looming threat, and the overwhelming bureaucratic machinery of a military death investigation. Marcus heard it, though. He didn't process it consciously, not at first, but somewhere deep in the basement of his mind, a gear turned. The memorial for Rohr was brief and functional, as all desert funerals are. Keller said the appropriate words with the appropriate weight, his voice echoing off the metal containers. Men who had served with Rohr for years stood with their helmets in their hands, their expressions flat and compressed as they struggled to hide their terror. Maya stood at the very edge of the formation, her head bowed in a posture of perfect, somber respect. Marcus watched her. He watched the way she didn't fidget, the way she didn't scan the horizon for the shooter like the others did. She was still, perfectly, unnervingly still. The sweep teams went out that afternoon, scouring the desert in a 12-mile radius. They returned with nothing. No evidence of a shooting position, no brass, no tracks in the shifting sand, no disturbance in the terrain that would suggest a long-range setup. The sensors along the perimeter showed absolutely zero external movement in the 12 hours preceding the death. Underground, Keller decided, his voice desperate during the evening debrief. They're using tunnels. That's how they're getting close enough for a shot without triggering the sensors. Tunnels take months to construct, Captain Corporal Whitfield argued. Keller slammed his hand on the table. They've had months. We've been operating in this region for 2 years. They've been digging while we've been sleeping. We're looking for tunnel entrances. We're looking for everything. The second death came 36 hours later, and it destroyed the tunnel theory before the first shovel could even hit the ground. Sergeant Antoine Brooks, an 11-year veteran with 3 combat deployments under his belt, was a man who slept with one ear open. He was found dead inside his own bunk. There was no way into that tent that didn't involve passing a sentry or tripping a sensor. Inside the perimeter, Caldwell said, his voice barely a whisper. He stood in the cramped quarters of the bunkhouse, his eyes fixed on the small, familiar wound at the base of Brooks's skull. The shot originated from inside the perimeter. The silence that followed was the specific, heavy silence of highly trained soldiers realizing that every assumption they had about their safety was a lie. This wasn't an external threat. This wasn't a ghost in the dunes. This was a wolf in the fold. Keller didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was cold enough to frost the air. Secure all personal weapons, full inventory, every round accounted for. Now, Sergeant Apprentice looked at him, his eyes wide. Every round, Captain, every single one, Keller barked. It was the only logical call, the only way to regain a sense of control. It was also exactly what Maya Collins had anticipated. When the inventory came back clean, every weapon accounted for, every standard issue round present and accounted for. It would eliminate the most obvious explanation and force the investigation back toward the advanced technology theory, giving her the room she needed to finish what she had started. Marcus noticed that Maya volunteered to assist with the weapons inventory. He watched her move through the process with a calm efficiency that was, in retrospect, slightly too practiced. She handled the rifles and the sidearms with a familiarity that went beyond her role as a medic. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself it was the sleep deprivation, the heat, the way the mind twists when it's looking for a monster. He told himself a lot of things to avoid looking at the truth. 2 men, Keller said that night in a closed-door meeting. He had included only the senior NCOs and Marcus. He had chosen Marcus because he had noticed the young man's penchant for observation and decided it was an asset he couldn't afford to waste. 2 men in 48 hours. Division is going to want heads on pikes, and right now we don't have a single answer that holds water. We have one that makes sense, Sergeant Apprentice said, his voice low and dangerous. Keller looked at him, his eyes narrow. We've got a shooter with access inside this wire, Apprentice continued. That's the only explanation that fits both kills, not tunnels, not physics-defying weapons. Someone who lives here, someone who eats with us. The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of calculation. Every man in the room was running the math, looking at the person to their left and their right, wondering if the person they trusted with their life was the one planning to take it. You're saying we have a traitor, Keller said, the words sounding like a confession. I'm saying we have an enemy inside the wire, Apprentice corrected. How they got there is the question. Keller disbanded the meeting without a resolution, which was a resolution in itself. He wasn't ready to turn the investigation inward. To do so would be to admit a level of institutional failure that no career could survive. Marcus went back to his bunk, but he didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, his mind assembling a list of things he had seen, things that didn't mean anything individually, but together formed a terrifying picture. Maya Collins had been the first on the scene for both deaths. She had known about the sensor anomaly before it was reported. She had moved through the weapons inventory like she was checking a grocery list. And then there was the shadow. The night before Brooks died, Marcus had been walking back from the observation post when he passed the medical tent. The light inside had been on, casting a sharp silhouette against the canvas wall. It wasn't the shadow of a medic organizing bandages. It was the shadow of someone working with small, mechanical parts. Precise movements, deliberate, the way a person's hands move when they are assembling a complex machine. He had convinced himself it was nothing at the time. Now he knew better. The third death occurred in the pre-dawn gray, before the sun had a chance to burn the chill off the sand. Corporal Ray Jensen, a 12-year veteran, was shot at an angle that the forensics team would later describe as geometrically impossible for any external position within a 20-meter radius. Marcus was on watch when the shout went up. He didn't hear a shot. He heard nothing but the wind whistling through the razor wire. He found Meyer already there, already kneeling in the dirt, her kit open and her hands busy. He stood 6 feet away and watched her. He didn't look at the body. He looked at her hands. They were steady. No tremor, no adrenaline-fueled shaking, no sign of the frantic desperation that usually accompanies a medic trying to save a comrade. She was a machine. She looked up, and for a split second their eyes met. Her eyes were calm, not the calm of a professional under pressure, but something deeper and much more frightening. It was the calm of a person who had already seen the end of the story. In that flicker of eye contact, Marcus read everything. She knew. She knew the investigation would fail. She knew the drones would find nothing. She knew Keller would keep looking at the horizon while the threat sat right next to him. And behind that calm, there was no guilt. There was only purpose. By the time Keller assembled the unit for the morning briefing, Marcus had made his choice. He wouldn't report his suspicions yet. An accusation without proof would be suicide in a unit this volatile. Keller was already breaking under the pressure. Marcus would watch. He would be the observer he was trained to be. "We're expanding the perimeter to 30 miles, Keller announced, his voice cracking. "Division is sending more drones. We will find this shooter." 3 men, Captain Corporal Whitfield said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. 3 men in 3 days, no trace, no sound. You know what the men are saying. They're saying it's a ghost. They're saying we're being hunted by something we can't fight. There are no ghosts. Keller screamed, the sound echoing harshly in the small room. "Then what is it?" Whitfield challenged. "It's a person," Keller said, lowering his voice until it was a lethal whisper. "A very skilled person who is going to make one mistake. And when they do, I will tear them apart with my bare hands." He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on every face. He looked at Maya, and his gaze passed over her as if she were a piece of furniture. "Every one of you needs to be on high alert. You see anything unusual, you report it to me directly." Maya raised her hand, her expression one of soft, maternal concern. "Captain, I'd like to propose an enhanced triage protocol. Given the stress the men are under, I think daily mental health check-ins would be beneficial. I can conduct them individually in the medical tent. It would help maintain operational effectiveness." Keller nodded, looking relieved that someone was offering a solution to a problem he could actually understand. "Approved. Good thinking, Collins." "Thank you, sir," she said, her pen already moving in her notebook. Marcus watched her write. He thought about what Caldwell had said about the fragmentation of the round. He thought about the specific ammunition that would be required to produce that result, something non-standard, something small enough to be hidden in a medical kit. He thought about the 43 deaths across the region. Field medics were rotated more often than any other personnel. They were needed everywhere. Their movement between units was expected, even encouraged. How many of those 43 deaths had occurred while Maya Collins was attached to the unit? The thought turned his blood to ice. If she was as good as she seemed, the investigation would never catch her. Keller's drones were looking at the sand, but the killer was looking at the charts. The only way to stop her was from the inside. Marcus sat on his bunk that evening, his notebook open, but he wasn't writing. He was thinking about the shadow on the canvas. He was thinking about the purpose in her eyes. He was 26 years old, and he was more terrified than he had ever been, not because of the desert or the invisible shooter, but because he was the only one who saw the wolf. He made a decision. He would follow her. He would wait for the cover of night, and he would see what happened inside that medical tent when the lights were low. It was a dangerous gamble, perhaps a fatal one, but it was the only move left on the board. Somewhere in the distance, a lamp flickered to life inside the medical tent. The shadow of a woman with careful, deliberate hands began to move against the canvas. Marcus did not sleep. He lay on his cot with his boots laced tight, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his heart a drumbeat in the silence. The camp was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. He could hear the heavy, uneven breathing of the men around him, men who were dreaming of ghosts and tunnels, unaware that the real threat was only 40 yards away, preparing for the next names on her list. He waited until the shift changed, until the sound of sergeant apprentices' snores signaled that the most observant man in the tent was out of the equation. He didn't take his rifle. A soldier moving through camp with a rifle at 0200 was a target. He took his sidearm, ensuring the holster was silent, and slipped through the tent flap. The air was biting now, the desert's heat having vanished into the atmosphere. He moved in a wide, slow arc, staying in the deep shadows cast by the supply containers. He knew the rotation of the observation posts. He had memorized the gaps in their sweeps just as she had. He approached the medical tent from the rear, where the generator's low hum provided a mask for his footsteps. He was 10 yards away when he heard it. A voice. It was low, rhythmic, and controlled. She wasn't speaking to anyone in the camp. She was speaking into a radio, her voice devoid of the soft, comforting tone she used with the soldiers. Marcus pressed himself against the cold metal of a container, his breath coming in shallow hitches. He crept closer, his eyes fixed on the glowing canvas. The shadow was there again, those hands moving with mechanical precision, assembling something small and silver. He reached the edge of the tent, his fingers brushing the fabric. He could hear the words now, clear and chilling. Target 47 neutralized, she said. Patterns established. The unit is beginning to fracture, proceeding to final phase. Marcus felt the world tilt. Target 47. Rohr, Brooks, and Jensen were just numbers in a sequence that had started long before they arrived in this desert. He looked through a tiny gap in the tent's rear flap. Maya Collins was sitting at her desk, but it wasn't a desk anymore. It was an armory. Spread out before her were the components of a weapon that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a battlefield. It was a high-pressure pneumatic delivery system designed to fire sub-caliber, pre-fragmented rounds at velocities that bypassed the acoustic signature of traditional gunpowder. No shell casings, no muzzle flash, no sound. It was the perfect murder weapon, hidden in the one place no one would ever look. She was holding a small silver canister, her thumb tracing the rim. Marcus realized with a jolt of horror that she wasn't just a soldier or a traitor. She was something else entirely. She was a cleaner, a specialist sent to dismantle units from the inside for reasons he couldn't even begin to fathom. He shifted his weight, his boot catching on a loose stone. The sound was microscopic, a mere grain of sand shifting against another, but in the silence of the tent it sounded like a landslide. Inside, the shadow froze. The hand stopped moving. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that sucked the air out of Marcus's lungs. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to in years that she would think it was the wind. After an eternity, she spoke again, but not into the radio. "You should have stayed in your bunk, Marcus," she said, her voice soft, almost disappointed. She didn't turn around. She didn't reach for a weapon. She just sat there, looking at her reflection in the polished metal of the canister. It was then that Marcus realized the true depth of his mistake. He hadn't found her secret. She had allowed him to see it. He was target 48. The realization didn't come with a burst of adrenaline. It came with a cold, heavy weight that settled in his gut. He was alone in the dark, 30 miles from help, with a killer who didn't make mistakes. He reached for his sidearm, his fingers trembling, but before he could even clear the holster, the light in the tent went out. The desert was plunged into total darkness, and the only sound left was the slow, steady rhythm of a medic's breathing. The night air in the desert was a physical weight, cold and dry, pressing against the lungs with every breath. Marcus Hale stood in the deep shadow of a corrugated supply container, his back pressed against the cold, ridged metal. He held his breath, not because he was hiding from a physical enemy he could see, but because he was hiding from a truth he had only just begun to grasp. To his left, the thin fabric of the medical annex fluttered in a stray gust of wind. Inside, the low, steady hum of a field radio vibrated through the silence. It wasn't the standard issue encrypted channel the unit used for tactical chatter. Marcus knew that frequency like the rhythm of his own pulse. This was a carrier tone he didn't recognize, something private, something unauthorized, and something terrifyingly disciplined. He heard her voice then. It was Maya Collins, the woman who had spent the last several weeks patching their wounds and offering the kind of quiet, steadying presence that kept a unit from fraying at the edges. But the voice coming through the canvas now wasn't the voice of a healer. It was flat, melodic in its precision, and entirely devoid of the warmth she used as a professional mask. 3 confirmed, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a gavel. Timeline holding, no deviations. There was a pause, a crackle of atmospheric static that felt like a lifetime of heartbeats. They're looking at the perimeter fence. Keller ordered a 30-meter drone sweep today. He thinks it's external. Another pause followed, longer this time, filled only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the camp's generators. He won't look inside. Men like Keller never look inside. That's the structural flaw I've been counting on. Then a sharp, final click. The radio went dead. Marcus stayed pinned against the metal container, motionless for a full 30 seconds. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the hollow of his chest. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived the kind of kinetic engagements that turned men into shells of themselves, had walked through the fire of urban combat and the freezing terror of mountain ambushes. He had always believed his nerve was a fixed point, but what he had just heard wasn't the frantic rambling of a soldier on the brink of a breakdown. It wasn't the sound of a grudge or a momentary lapse in sanity. It was the language of an operation. It was coordinated, structured, and executed with a level of patience that didn't span days, but months, perhaps even years. She was reporting to someone, which meant the ghost they had been hunting wasn't just among them. She was part of a larger machine. He forced himself to breathe, a slow, deliberate inhalation that burned his throat. He needed to think. He needed to get to Captain Keller, and he had to do it without alerting her. In this camp, every movement was a telegraph. If she saw him moving with purpose, if she sensed the shift in the air, he knew exactly what would happen. He would be the next body the unit found, twisted at an impossible angle, discovered in a place he shouldn't have been, with no shell casing to provide an answer and no explanation to offer the grieving. Marcus pushed off the container and began to walk. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He matched his pace to the casual, aimless stride of a man who couldn't sleep and had decided to stretch his legs in the midnight chill. He passed the primary observation post, nodding casually to the sentry on duty. The man looked back with the glazed, weary eyes of someone who had been staring into the black void for too long and saw nothing of interest in Marcus's face. Marcus reached his own tent, sat on the edge of his narrow cot, and stared at his boots. The absurdity of his position began to sink in. He was 26 years old, a sergeant in a forgotten corner of the world, and he was currently calculating how to manage his commanding officer because the chain of command had effectively been decapitated from the inside. He didn't sleep, but he lay back and closed his eyes for 3 hours, forcing his body into a state of simulated rest. When the first hint of gray began to bleed into the eastern sky, he woke. Corporal Whitfield was on the cot across from him, one arm thrown over his eyes, his mouth slightly open in the heavy, vulnerable sleep of the exhausted. A sudden, sharp clarity hit Marcus. This man doesn't know. None of them know. Every minute they remained in the dark was another minute Maya Collins owned. She didn't just have the initiative, she had the very ground they stood on. Marcus stood outside Keller's private container unit at the far eastern edge of the camp, just as the dawn began to sharpen the edges of the horizon. He knocked twice. It wasn't a casual knock. It was the specific cadence of a subordinate bringing news that couldn't wait for a morning briefing. Keller opened the door within 30 seconds. He wasn't wearing his full uniform. His shirt was unbuttoned, his undershirt stained with the dust of the previous day. His eyes, however, were wide and alert. Whatever ghosts Keller was wrestling with, they were keeping him awake too. "Hail," the captain said, his voice gravelly and low. "Sir, I need 5 minutes," Marcus replied. Keller looked at him for a long moment, searching Marcus's face for the source of the tension he clearly radiated. Something in the set of Marcus's jaw or the stillness of his posture communicated the gravity of the situation. Keller stepped back, gesturing for him to enter without a word. The interior of the container was cramped, smelling of stale coffee and electronic heat. Marcus didn't waste time. He laid it out in a sequence of hard facts, stripped of emotion. He told him about the shadow he'd seen on the canvas the night Brooks died. He pointed out the impossible reaction times during the chaos of Roar's death. He detailed the subtle, clinical way Maya had moved through the weapons inventory, checking things she had no business checking. And finally, he recounted the radio transmission. 3 confirmed, timeline holding. He won't look inside. Keller listened in a way that was fundamentally uncharacteristic. Usually the captain was a man of constant motion and frequent interruption. He processed information by talking through it, using his own voice as a hammer to shape the world into something he understood. But as Marcus spoke, Keller remained perfectly still. He didn't fidget, he didn't question, and he didn't look away. The silence that followed Marcus's account was heavier than the words themselves. It told Marcus that Keller wasn't just taking him seriously, he was already starting to see the holes in his own perimeter. When Marcus finished, Keller sat down slowly on the edge of his cot, the metal frame creaking under his weight. "You're telling me our medical officer is the ghost sniper?" "I'm telling you what I saw and heard, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Do you understand what you're saying?" Keller asked, looking up. His eyes were bloodshot. "Do you understand what this means? If you're right, we've invited the executioner into the house and given her a seat at the table." "Yes, sir, I understand. And if you're wrong?" "Then I'm wrong, sir, and we deal with the fallout of my paranoia. But, sir," Marcus paused, choosing his words with the precision of a jeweler, "you said it yourself in the briefing. A very skilled person is going to make one mistake. She made one. She made it last night with that radio. She thinks you aren't looking inside. She thinks the structural flaw of your leadership is that you'll always look at the horizon for a threat." Keller rubbed his face with both hands, the sound of his palms against his stubble loud in the small space. When he lowered them, his expression had shifted. The disbelief was gone, replaced by the hard, cold mask of a man moving into tactical mode. The shock had been processed. Now there was only the problem and the solution. "If we move on her openly, she runs or she escalates," Marcus noted. "I know," Keller said, his voice regaining its command. "We need her to keep operating. We need to give her enough rope." "I know what we need, Hale," Keller continued, his voice taking on a sharp edge that wasn't directed at Marcus but at the situation itself. "What I need from you right now is to go back to your bunk. You behave exactly as you have been. You say nothing to no one, not to Apprentice, not to Whitfield, nobody. If a single person changes their behavior around her, she'll know. And if she knows, the next person to die won't be a target of opportunity. It'll be us." "And you, sir?" Marcus asked. Keller looked at him, and for a split second, Marcus saw a flash of something ancient and weary in the captain's eyes. "I'm going to do something I should have done 3 days ago. I'm going to watch her instead of the horizon." Marcus left the container and walked back to his bunk. The sun was fully up now, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. He lay down and stared at the ceiling of his tent, his mind racing. The clock had changed. Everything would accelerate now. Secrets of this magnitude had a way of building their own momentum once a second person was brought into the light. The air in the camp felt different, thicker, more electric, like the moments just before a massive lightning strike. The fourth day brought 2 changes that Marcus noticed immediately. The first was that Keller began including Meyer in briefings she had never attended before. He framed it as a necessity for expanding the medical officer's situational awareness, a way to plan for triage in the event of a mass casualty incident. It was a thin justification, but it was grounded in military logic, and Meyer accepted it with the same gracious professionalism she always displayed. She sat in the corner of the command center, her notebook open, her pen moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. She looked like a woman dedicated to her duty, a calm port in the storm of their mounting casualties. But Marcus was almost certain she knew something had shifted. The second change was in her own behavior. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that most people would ignore or dismiss as a byproduct of stress. She began varying her routines. She didn't take the same path from the mess hall to the infirmary. She rescheduled the individual mental health check-ins Keller had authorized, shifting the order of the roster in a way that didn't match her initial plan. It was a recalibration. She was a predator that had felt a change in the wind and was adjusting her position to keep the scent. Marcus watched her and felt a specific, cold kind of fear. The fear that comes from realizing the person you are hunting is better at the game than you are. The morning briefing on day 4 was a study in controlled collapse. Losing 3 men in 3 days had stripped away the thin veneer of professional composure that the unit used as its primary armor. Beneath the surface, the men were fracturing. Corporal Whitfield had gone entirely inward, his earlier bravado replaced by a terrifying, hollow stillness. Sergeant Apprentice was running purely on operational momentum, his years of training keeping him upright while his eyes remained fixed on nothing. And then there was Private First Class Donovan Webb. Webb was 28, a man who had joined the service with high-minded ideals about significance and purpose, only to find himself trapped in a nightmare that didn't follow the rules of the brochure. He hadn't slept in days. Marcus could hear him at night, the sound of a man lying perfectly still, his breath hitched as he performed the agonizing mental math of his own survival. "What are we doing?" Webb asked, his voice cutting through Keller's opening remarks. It wasn't an aggressive outburst. It was the raw, honest question of a human being who had reached the absolute limit of his endurance. I mean genuinely, sir, what are we doing? The protocol we came in with isn't working. 3 of us are dead. Brooks died inside the wire, sir. Inside, I'd like to understand the new protocol. The new protocol, Keller said, his voice measured and dangerously calm, is what I am about to brief you on. With respect, sir, Webb replied, his voice trembling slightly. The old protocol was also what you were about to brief us on. And then Rohr died. Then Brooks. Now Jensen. I'd appreciate it if the new protocol was something qualitatively different from the simply waiting to die. Webb, apprentice snapped, his voice sharp with the need to maintain order. I'm not being disrespectful, Sarge, Webb said, turning his bloodshot eyes toward apprentice. I'm asking a real question. You're asking it in the wrong setting, apprentice countered. When's the right setting? Webb asked. After number 4, the room went cold. The tension was a physical pressure, a weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. Marcus watched Keller. The captain absorbed the pressure without flinching, his face a mask of iron. Whatever Keller's failings were, and Marcus suspected there were many, the man was capable of carrying immense weight. He didn't buckle. Webb, Keller said quietly, his voice dropping to a register that commanded attention without needing to shout. I hear you, every word, and you deserve an honest answer. Here it is, we are operating in conditions that have no clean precedent. This enemy is unlike anything we were prepared for. That means we adapt in real time. It means we question every assumption. And it means we do not let fear make our decisions for us. Is that good enough for right now? Webb held the captain's gaze for a long moment, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself together. Finally, he nodded once and looked down at the table. Good, Keller said. Then let's work. Across the table, Maya Collins was writing in her notebook. Marcus tried to catch a glimpse of the pages, but she held the book at an angle that obscured the text. Her pen moved with that same deliberate, haunting rhythm. He had the sudden, sickening conviction that she wasn't taking notes on the tactical situation. She was writing a ledger, a record of something they couldn't see. The 4th death happened at 11:47 in the morning. It was a significant shift because it broke the pattern they had spent the last 72 hours trying to map. Rohr, Brooks, and Jensen had all been taken during the low-visibility windows of dawn or dusk. The operational assumption, the only thing they had to cling to, was that the kills were timed to take advantage of the changing light. Daylight was supposed to be the safe zone. It was supposed to be the time when they could breathe. It was not. Corporal James Whitfield was found near the drone maintenance area at the eastern edge of the compound. He had been killed with the same terrifying, clinical precision as the others. There had been no sound, no witness, and no struggle. A single devastating wound had ended his life before his nervous system could even process the sensation of pain. The most chilling part wasn't the death itself, but the location. Whitfield had been in the direct line of sight of 2 other soldiers who were less than 50 yards away. They had seen nothing. They had heard nothing. One moment Whitfield was standing there, and the next he was part of the landscape. The camp broke quietly in the 15 minutes after the body was discovered. It wasn't a loud, chaotic breakdown. The training was too deep for that. The protocols engaged, the perimeters were tightened, and the right people moved to their assigned positions. But the psychological architecture of the unit, the shared belief that they were a cohesive, protected entity, cracked down the center. Everyone felt the crack, and no one dared to acknowledge it. To speak of it was to admit that they were no longer a unit, but a collection of individual targets waiting for their turn. Marcus felt the crack too, but he felt something else alongside it, a cold, analytical clarity. Whitfield had been killed near the drone maintenance area on the eastern side of the camp. At exactly 11:30, Maya Collins had been scheduled for a mental health check-in with Private Webb on the western side of the camp. Webb had confirmed it. She had been with him until 12:10. She had an alibi, a perfect, documented alibi, which meant she hadn't pulled the trigger. Or it meant the trigger had been pulled by a mechanism she had set in motion long before she sat down with Webb. The entire sequence, the check-in, the timing, the location of the kill, was a piece of misdirection so precise it functioned like a Swiss watch. She had set the gears, wound the spring, and let it run while she sat across from a terrified private, offering him a listening ear and a calm voice. Marcus felt a surge of something that wasn't fear. It was closer to awe. He hated himself for the feeling, but he couldn't deny the recognition of a level of operational intelligence that far exceeded anything he had ever seen. She was using their own schedules, their own psychological vulnerabilities, and their own safety protocols as the very instruments of their destruction. He found Keller at the drone maintenance area. The captain was standing over Whitfield's body, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. His face was a blank slate, the expression of a man who was finally seeing the true shape of the monster he had invited into his home. Marcus moved to stand beside him, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. "She had a session with Webb on the western side at 11:30, sir," Marcus said. Keller didn't move for a long time. Then a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The session ran until after the body was found," Marcus continued. "Webb confirmed it personally. She was with him the whole time, which means she set it up to cover this," Keller whispered. "Yes, sir, which means she knew the timing in advance." Keller turned to look at him, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated horror. "She's not reacting to opportunities, Hale. She's not hunting us. She's following a schedule. She has a list." The word list hit Marcus with more force than a physical blow. It changed everything. If she had a list, then the kills weren't random acts of terror designed to break the unit's morale. They were targets, predetermined, sequenced, and intentional. She hadn't arrived at this camp to see what she could do. She had arrived knowing exactly who was going to die and in what order. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice tight. "If she has a list, then she has an end point. She knows when she's done." Keller's jaw tightened, and when she reaches it, she disappears, or she stops disappearing and becomes something else entirely. The silence between them was suffocating. "I need to know who is on that list," Keller said. "We'd have to get to her kit, sir. Whatever she's keeping in that notebook, we have to do it without alerting her." Keller looked back down at Whitfield. He looked for a long time, and Marcus saw a flicker of something that looked like profound, agonizing guilt pass over the captain's face. "I'll handle the notebook," Keller said. "You keep watching her. Every move, every breath. You track her like she's tracking us." "Understood, sir." And Hale, Keller's voice dropped to a barely audible rasp. "If she makes a move on anyone before we have the full picture, you stop her, by any means necessary." Marcus met the captain's eyes. "Yes, sir." He walked away from the body, leaving the captain alone in the dust. He returned to the main compound and found Maya Collins sitting outside the medical tent on an overturned plastic crate. She was writing in her notebook, a cup of coffee steaming on the ground beside her. She looked up as he approached, her face shifting into the appropriate expression of grief and strain. "You okay, Marcus?" she asked, her voice soft. "Not really," he said, and for the first time in days he wasn't lying. "Nobody is," she replied, closing the notebook with a soft thud. "You want to talk? My door is always open." "Not right now," he said. "I understand." She picked up her coffee and offered him a small, weary smile. "The offer stands." Marcus nodded and walked past her. Every nerve in his body was screaming, a high-frequency vibration of pure adrenaline. He was performing the hardest task a human could be asked to do, maintaining the mask of normalcy in the presence of a predator that had already decided his fate. That evening, the air grew even colder as the sun dipped below the dunes. Sergeant Apprentice found Marcus near the equipment storage. The older man looked like he had aged a decade in the last 24 hours. "Walk with me," Apprentice said. It wasn't an invitation. They walked the inner perimeter in silence. They did 2 full loops before Apprentice spoke. "You've been watching Collins," he said, his voice flat. Marcus kept his eyes on the horizon. "I've been watching everyone, Sarge." "Don't do that," Apprentice said, stopping in his tracks. "Don't manage me. I'm not Keller." He turned to face Marcus, and his expression was one of raw, unfiltered exhaustion. "I've been watching her longer than you have, Hale, since before we even deployed." Marcus went very still. "What are you talking about?" "I pulled her records," Apprentice said, "or I tried to. You know what I found? Nothing. Not a thin file, not a redacted file. Nothing. It was like the woman didn't exist until 8 months ago. Whoever built her profile was an artist, but they didn't know what a real service history looks like. It was too clean, too perfect." "You didn't go to Keller with this?" Marcus asked. "No," Apprentice said, looking down at the sand. "Why not?" Apprentice looked up, and Marcus saw a flicker of something he had never expected to see in the sergeant: fear. Not fear of Maya, but fear of the past. "Because of what's in the records that *do* exist, Hale. The operational records, not hers, the units. The assignments that overlap with the time before her file went blank." Marcus felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "What assignments?" 3 years ago, Apprentice said, his voice trembling. "A covert operation in a border region. A village-level sweep. It was classified as infrastructure elimination, but that's not what it was. There were 14 civilian casualties. Unreported. The official record says 0. I know because I was there. I was following orders, and I have been living with the weight of it every day since." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Marcus absorbed the information, watching as it reorganized everything he thought he knew. The Phantom wasn't a ghost, she was a consequence. She was a debt that had finally come due. Rohr, Brooks, Jensen, Whitfield, they hadn't been random targets. They were the men who had been in that village. She's not a sniper, Marcus whispered. She's a correction. Apprentice nodded slowly. She's writing the names back into the ledger that Keller tried to erase. Keller signed those orders, Hale. He was the one who authorized the sweep. He was the one who filed the report that said nothing happened. They stood in the dark, the distant hum of a drone, the only sound in the vast, empty desert. Marcus thought about the 43 men in the camp. He wondered how many of them had been at that village or at other villages like it. He thought about the notebook and the list of names. It wasn't just a kill list. It was a memorial for the people the world had been told didn't exist. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. Prince was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the lights of the medical tent. "I'm going to do what I should have done 3 years ago," he said. "I'm going to tell the truth. To Keller. To whoever survives this long enough to hear it." He walked away, leaving Marcus alone in the darkness. Marcus watched him go, then turned his gaze toward the medical tent. The lamp was on inside, casting the shadow of a woman with careful, steady hands against the canvas. He watched the shadow move and felt the crushing weight of a truth that had no clean resolution. The enemy wasn't outside the wire. The enemy was the very history they had tried to bury, walking among them, serving them coffee, and waiting for the right moment to strike the next name from the list. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat on his cot, the silence of the tent amplified by the absence of Whitfield across from him. He thought about the village. He thought about the 14 names. And he understood that he was no longer part of a military operation. He was a witness to a slow-motion execution. He understood that the men he served with, men he had trusted with his life, were built on a foundation of secrets and blood. And the woman in the next tent was the inevitable result of those secrets. At 4:15 in the morning, the air at its coldest and the camp at its most vulnerable, Marcus made his move. He wasn't going to wait for Keller or Apprentice. He needed to see that notebook. He needed to know if the list stopped at the men from the village or if it had grown into something else. He needed to know if there was any way to stop the cycle before it consumed everyone. He moved through the camp with the practiced silence of a ghost. He reached the medical tent from the rear, avoiding the main path. The lamp inside was off. He paused at the canvas, listening to the rhythm of the occupant's breathing. It was slow, deep, and perfectly controlled. She was either asleep or she was performing sleep with the skill of a master. He slipped through the tent flap, his hand moving toward the equipment table. He saw the notebook, lying right where she always kept it, next to her field kit. His fingers touched the cover, the cardboard cold and slightly damp from the night air. He began to lift it when her voice cut through the darkness, calm and entirely awake. "I've been waiting for you to do that, Marcus." He didn't jump. He didn't reach for his weapon. He simply froze, his hand still on the book as the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate. He needed her to see that he wasn't attacking, even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Maya Collins was sitting upright on her cot. She wasn't holding a weapon, but she didn't need to. The way she sat, perfectly balanced and entirely still, was more intimidating than any firearm. The moonlight filtered through the tent flap, catching the edge of her face and turning her eyes into dark, unreadable pits. "You're very good," she said, her voice a low, melodic whisper. "Better than the others. I wondered when you'd finally decide to look for the truth." Marcus didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of what he knew and what he was seeing was too much for words. "You found out about the village, didn't you?" she asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was almost conversational, as if they were discussing a minor tactical detail. "Apprentice told you. I could see it in the way he walked tonight. The way the air around him had finally collapsed." "Who are you?" Marcus managed to ask, his voice a dry rasp. "I'm the person you all forgot," she said. "I'm the 14 names. I'm the silence after the orders were signed, and I'm the one who's going to make sure the record is finally accurate." She stood up then, a shadow moving within shadows. Marcus watched her, and for the first time he didn't see a medic or a sniper. He saw a force of nature, a consequence that could no longer be deferred. The list wasn't just a piece of paper. It was an inevitability. And as he stood there in the dark, Marcus realized with a sickening jolt that his own name might not be on the list, but that didn't mean he was going to survive the night. The desert wind picked up outside, rattling the canvas of the tent with a sound like distant gunfire. Marcus Hale looked at the woman who had become the unit's conscience and its executioner, and he realized that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting. It was the moment you realized you were on the wrong side of history. Maya stepped forward into the sliver of moonlight. Her expression was one of profound, weary sadness. "I don't want to kill you, Marcus. You weren't there. You're just a witness. But the problem with witnesses is that they eventually have to choose." "Choose what?" Marcus asked. "Whose silence they're willing to live with," she said. The silence in the tent grew thick and suffocating. Marcus looked at the notebook in his hand, then back at the woman in front of him. He knew that whatever he did next would change the course of his life or end it. Outside, the camp slept on, unaware that the final reckoning had already begun. The structural flaw Keller had ignored had finally brought the whole building down, and as Marcus stood in the ruins, he realized that the ghost they had been hunting wasn't a monster at all. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, he could finally see the true face of the men he had been calling brothers. The notebook felt heavy in his hand, a physical manifestation of the lives that had been stolen. He looked at Maya, and in the darkness, he saw not an enemy, but a survivor who had been forced to become a weapon. The air between them was charged with the weight of the 14 names, a silent chorus demanding to be heard. And as the first light of a new day began to touch the desert sand, Marcus Hale understood that the list was far from finished. The cycle of blood and secrets had one more turn to make, and he was the only one left who could decide how it ended. He didn't put the notebook down. He held it tight, the cardboard biting into his palm. He looked Maya Collins in the eye, and for the first time since he had arrived in this God-forsaken desert, he felt like he was finally seeing the world for what it really was. "Show me the names," he whispered. Maya didn't move for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched the cover of the book. Her hand was steady, her touch light. "There are 14 of them," she said, "and 4 left to go." The names on the page weren't just ink. They were a roadmap to a crime that had been buried in the sand. Marcus looked down at the first name on the list, and as he read it, he felt the last of his illusions crumble into dust. The war he thought he was fighting was a lie. The only real battle was the one happening right now in the quiet of a medical tent, between a man who wanted the truth and a woman who had become the truth. As the sun began to rise, casting long, bloody streaks across the horizon, Marcus Hale made his choice. He didn't run for Keller. He didn't call for the guards. He simply stood there, a witness to the end of a world, and prepared himself for whatever came next. The desert was vast, the secrets were deep, and the list was almost complete. And in the silence of the morning, the only sound was the rustle of a page turning, and the quiet, steady breathing of 2 people who had finally stopped running from the ghosts of the past. The desert dawn was not a release of light, but a slow, bruising transition from the cold black of the small hours to a hazy, suffocating gray. Inside the medical tent, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the stale, recycled oxygen of the ventilation units. Maya Collins sat on the edge of her cot, fully dressed, her hands resting visible and still on her knees. The clinical mask she had worn for days, the practiced, neutral expression of the unit medic, the superficial mask of concern she used during mental health checks, had finally cracked. In its place was something Marcus Hale had never seen before. It wasn't the look of a killer, nor the look of a victim. It was the expression of a person who had been carrying a mountain on her shoulders in total silence and had finally, after years of staggering under the weight, reached the place where she could set it down. "You heard me last night," she said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the rising inflection that would make it a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same precision she used when stitching a wound. She didn't look at him immediately. She was looking at the space where he had been standing outside the tent hours before. "I knew someone was out there when the transmission was live. I could feel the change in the air, the way the shadows shifted against the canvas. I didn't know it was you for certain until the briefing this morning. I watched you. I watched you fail to look at me, and that was the loudest thing in the room." She paused, finally turning her gaze toward him. It was a piercing, unsettlingly direct look. "Most people can't help but look at me, Marcus. They look because they are looking for a mother or a sister or a caregiver. They look because I'm the person who keeps them alive. But you stopped. You've been watching me since Jensen, haven't you?" She didn't offer an apology for the deaths. There was no flicker of guilt in her eyes, no tremors in her hands. Marcus stood near the entrance, the flap of the tent behind him vibrating slightly in the wind. "How long?" he asked, his voice sounding raspy even to his own ears. "How long have you known I was on to you? You were the only one in the response group whose eyes went to my hands instead of the body," she replied. Everyone else was looking at the blood, the trauma, the wreckage of a human being. You were looking at the tools. You were looking at the person who was supposed to be fixing it, wondering if she was the one who broke it. The silence that followed was heavy, amplified by the low, mechanical drone of the UAV making its endless circuit overhead. The sound was a rhythmic, thrumming rotation that felt less like a machine and more like the breathing of the camp itself, a watchful, indifferent god. Marcus took a breath, feeling the dry heat already beginning to seep through the fabric of the tent. How many names are on the list? Maya looked at him for a long, calculating moment. She seemed to be weighing him not just as a soldier or a witness, but as a variable in a complex equation she had been solving for 3 years. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached beside her cot and picked up a weathered notebook. She held it out toward him. The cover was scarred, the corners frayed by friction and time. Marcus crossed the narrow space between them, his boots silent on the heavy-duty floor liner. He took the book from her. It felt heavier than it looked, a physical manifestation of a secret that had already cost 4 lives. When he opened it, he expected to find a kill list. He expected to see names scrawled in anger, checkboxes, dates of execution, the chaotic handwriting of someone consumed by a vendetta. But what he found was something far more terrifying in its order. It wasn't a list. It was a document. It was an unofficial archive, a meticulous record of names, dates, operational codes, and precise GPS coordinates. Beside each entry was a notation, a brief but devastating sentence connecting that name to a specific event that had occurred exactly 3 years prior. It was the operational record that the official military file claimed did not exist. Marcus turned the pages, his eyes scanning the columns. There were 14 names listed in a section marked for a village. None of them had military designations. None of them were combatants. Beside the names were ages, 61, 12, 45, 8. These were the unreported casualties, the ghosts that the system had scrubbed from the light of day. And below that village record, on a separate page, was a second list. 9 names. Every single one of them was currently present in this camp. Rohr, Brooks, Jensen, Whitfield. Those 4 names had been struck through with a single, clean line. 5 names remained. Marcus felt a cold sensation settle in his gut as he looked at the survivors. He knew 4 of them immediately, men he had served with, eaten with, and stood watch with. Sergeant Dale Princet, Corporal Antonio Reyes, Private First Class Donovan Webb, Specialist Carl Hutchkins. And at the very top of the remaining list, the name was underlined twice, encircled in a dark, aggressive ring of ink, Captain Ryan Keller. Marcus closed the notebook. The sound of the paper snapping shut felt like a gunshot in the quiet tent. Webb, he said. The name came out with more weight than he had intended, a mixture of disbelief and a strange, protective instinct. Webb was barely more than a kid when Marcus first met him. Something shifted in Maya's face. It wasn't a softening, but a hardening, like clay being fired in a kiln. Webb was there, she said. Her voice was flat, but it wasn't the flatness of cruelty. It was the sound of a position held for so long that it had become structural, a truth that could no longer be debated. He was 23 years old. He was there. He carried the order down from the command trailer to the firing line. He relayed the coordinates. He was 23 and he saw what the target was, and he did it anyway. But Princet, Marcus started, thinking of the man who had sat in the dark and confessed his soul. Princet has been carrying it. He's dying under the weight of it. Carrying it isn't the same as answering for it, Maya replied. She stood up then, her movements fluid and controlled. She didn't move toward him aggressively. She simply took up space in the tent, asserting her presence. Marcus set the notebook down on the equipment table next to a tray of surgical instruments. The cold steel of the scalpels caught the dim light. I need you to hear something, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I've heard everything, Marcus. I've spent 3 years listening to the excuses men make for the things they do when they think no one is watching. You haven't heard this, he countered, stepping closer so she couldn't look away. Because I didn't know it myself until last night. Princet came to me. He didn't know I was looking for a killer. He just knew he couldn't breathe anymore. He told me about the operation. He told me about the village, and he said he was going to tell the truth. He said he was going to tell whoever survives this camp long enough to hear it. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before. This one had texture. It was thick and electric. Marcus could almost see her mind working, processing this new data point, moving it through the complex system she used to evaluate threats, liabilities, and deviations from the plan she had constructed with such terrifying precision. Princet came to you? She asked slowly. Last night. He pulled your records, or tried to. He found the gaps in your history. He connected them to the operation, and he told you about Keller. Yes, Marcus said. She moved 2 steps toward the tent wall, her back to him for a moment. If Princess talks, it changes nothing for the village, she said, her voice muffled slightly by the canvas. Those 14 people are still dead. The official record still says 0. One soldier's confession to a junior private in a desert camp at 4 in the morning doesn't rewrite what the system buried. It's just more noise in the dark. No, Marcus agreed, but it's a start. Starts aren't enough, she snapped, turning back to him. Her eyes were bright with a sudden, fierce energy. We've had 3 years of starts. We've had 3 years of looking into it and internal reviews that go nowhere. They're more than nothing, Marcus said quietly. She looked at him then with an expression that was the most human thing he had seen on her face in 5 days. It wasn't softness, but exhaustion, a bone-deep, soul-crushing weariness. It was the look of someone who had been at war not for 5 days, but for 1,000. Someone who woke up every single morning and chose the war again before her feet even hit the floor. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to feel the weight of what that choice does to a person. My mother was one of the 14, she said. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. Marcus didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She was 61 years old, Maya continued, her voice level and clear. The grief inside her was evidently too large for ordinary expression, so it came out as a cold, hard fact. She had never held a weapon in her life. She grew vegetables in a patch of dirt that shouldn't have been able to grow anything. She kept goats. And every morning she used to get up before dawn to watch the light change on the hills. She told me it was the only hour of the day that belonged entirely to God, before the noise of the world started, before the soldiers and the drones. Maya took a breath, her chest heaving slightly. The coordinates in the official report put the strike 300 meters south of where it actually hit. 300 meters. In the world of precision munitions, that isn't an accident. It's a choice. A data entry error or something far worse. I've never been able to determine which. I'm sorry, Marcus said. Don't. She cut him off without anger, but with a finality that brooked no argument. Don't say that. That phrase is what people say when they want the conversation to end. They say it so they can feel like they've acknowledged the pain without having to do anything about it. Marcus absorbed that. He realized she was right. It was a hollow word in a place like this. What do you want instead? He asked. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes steady. I want the record corrected. I want the 14 names in an official document that says exactly what happened to them and exactly who authorized it. I want Keller to say it on the record, not in a desert where it can be buried again. And if he doesn't, her silence was the answer. The list would stay on schedule. Marcus thought about Webb, currently sitting on the observation post, awake and fractured, waiting for a morning that offered no peace. He thought about Princess, walking the inner perimeter with the weight of 3 years pressing down on his spine. He thought about Keller in his container unit, a man planning a trap for a ghost he didn't realize was already inside the wire. Give me 24 hours, Marcus said. Maya blinked. It was the first involuntary reaction he had seen from her, a tiny glitch in her composure. What? 24 hours before the list moves forward. Give me that window to get Keller on the record. You can't get Keller on the record, she said, her voice tinged with a sudden, sharp skepticism. Keller is a man who has spent 3 years making sure he is never on the record. He is the master of the unlogged conversation and the shredded memo. He doesn't know that I know about the village, Marcus argued. He doesn't know Princess talked. If I go to him with that notebook, he'll destroy it. But if there's a copy, if there's a version of this that exists somewhere else, somewhere he can't reach. Marcus paused, watching her. Is there? A ghost of a smile touched Maya's lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the recognition of a fellow player, the moment a chess player realizes their opponent has made a move they didn't anticipate. The radio transmission, she said. Who do you think was on the other end? I assumed another operative, Marcus admitted. A journalist, she said. Investigative. She's been building a file on this operation for 18 months. Every transmission I've made from this camp has been recorded, time-stamped, and documented on her end. Every word I say is being woven into a net that is closing around the people who authorized that strike. Marcus sat down on the edge of the equipment table, the reality of the situation sinking in. He let out a slow, jagged breath. Maya hadn't just been seeking revenge. She wasn't just a sniper picking off targets in the dark. She was building a parallel record. Every kill wasn't just a life taken. It was a piece of pressure, a calculated move to force an investigation that couldn't be dismissed as enemy action once the full picture became visible. She was a case officer, an assassin, and a whistleblower all wrapped into one. "The journalist has everything," he asked. "Everything except the final piece," she replied. "The direct acknowledgement from the man who gave the order. We have the logistics, the aftermath, and the cover-up. But we need his voice. We need Keller connecting himself to the order on a recorded line." Marcus finally understood the sequence of the list. It wasn't just about saving the most guilty for last to prolong the suffering. It was about isolation. It was about creating a situation where Keller was cornered, frightened, and so utterly alone that an admission of guilt became his only remaining path to survival, or at least the only way to stop the bleeding. "Okay," Marcus said, standing up. His mind was racing, aligning the pieces. "Then we do this differently." We," she interrupted. "You have a 24-hour window and I have a plan," Marcus said, ignoring the question of we for the moment. "Whether you take it or not is your choice, but I'm asking you to take it. I'm asking you to let the truth be the weapon instead of a bullet. Just for one day." The drone made another pass overhead, the sound vibrating through the tent poles. The camp was still and dark, a cluster of shadows in a vast, indifferent wasteland. Somewhere in the distance, Webb coughed on the observation post, the sound sharp and lonely. Maya Collins looked at Marcus Hale for a long time. He did not look away. He held her gaze, allowing her to read whatever she needed to find in him. In this space between a killer and a witness, transparency was the only currency that held any value. "Tell me the plan," she said finally. It took 12 minutes. He spoke quickly but clearly, laying out the architecture of the trap. She interrupted him 3 times, each time with a specific, technical objection about radio ranges, protocols, or Keller's likely psychological response. Her objections told him she was truly engaging with the idea, that she was looking for reasons it might work rather than reasons to reject it. When he finished, she remained quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the notebook. "If Keller doesn't respond the way you expect," she said, her voice low, "people die." "Yes," Marcus said, "more people than are currently on the list, possibly." "Yes, and you're comfortable with that risk?" "No," Marcus said, "I'm not comfortable with any of this." But comfort stopped being an option about 4 days ago. She almost smiled again. "Almost, Princess," she said. "He's on the list, I know. If I take your window, Princess stays alive long enough to tell the truth. That's the idea. And if he lies, if he decides that self-preservation outweighs whatever he felt on that perimeter last night, then your list stays accurate," Marcus said quietly. "And you make your own decision." She absorbed that, her precision visible even in her stillness. She was moving through the logic of it, checking the contingencies. "Go back to your bunk," she said. "You were never here." Marcus picked up the notebook from the table and held it out to her. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second as she took it, and in that brief contact, he felt the coldness of her skin. He felt the weight of the distance between the woman she had been in that village 3 years ago and the person the system had forced her to become. He left the tent and walked back through the dark compound. The camp felt like a graveyard waiting for the first shovel of dirt. Princess was asleep on his cot, one arm thrown over his eyes as if to shield himself from his own dreams. Webb was still out there in the dark, a lonely silhouette against the stars. Keller was in his container unit, and Marcus didn't yet know what the captain had been doing while he was in the medical tent. But he knew that by morning, everything would accelerate. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling of his tent, his eyes refusing to close. At 06:45, the sirens didn't go off, but the call for an emergency assembly rippled through the camp like a physical wave. Marcus knew the moment he saw Keller's face that something had shifted. The captain didn't look like a man under siege anymore. He had the expression of a man who had made a hard decision and locked the door behind it. There was no visible doubt, no residual calculation in his eyes. It was pure, compressed forward momentum. Last night, Keller began, his voice amplified by the morning stillness as he addressed the assembled unit. "I made contact with Division Command. I requested authorization for an immediate containment protocol. That authorization has been granted." The remaining members of Alpha 7 stood in a ragged line, a collection of exhausted men and one very calm woman. Webb was swaying slightly on his feet, his eyes bloodshot. Princess stood like a statue. Reyes and Hutchkins exchanged a nervous glance. Maya Collins stood at the far left, her hands at her sides, her face a perfect mask of attentive concern. Effective immediately, Keller continued, his gaze sweeping over them. "All personnel are confined to the central compound. There will be no solo movement, no unsupervised access to the perimeter or the equipment stores. All personal communications are suspended pending a full security review. Sir, Princess said, his voice cracking slightly. On what basis? On the basis that 4 of our people are dead and the shooter is inside this wire, Keller said. He let the words hang in the air, watching them sink in. The shooter is a member of this unit. The air in the compound seemed to vanish. Webb made a small, choked sound that wasn't quite a word. Reyes stepped back half a step before catching himself, his hand instinctively moving toward a sidearm he wasn't wearing. Hutchkins looked down at his own hands as if he expected to see blood on them. Marcus looked at Maya. This was the moment. This was where a person who didn't know they had been caught would react with shock or protest or the frantic agitation of the falsely accused. Her face didn't change by even a single degree. She looked at Keller with the same professional curiosity she might use to examine a minor rash. "Do you have a specific person in mind, Captain?" she asked. Her voice was steady, helpful even. "We're running a full review," Keller said, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. "Every person in this unit, starting now." "Of course," she said. "Whatever helps." Marcus watched Keller's expression. He saw the first visible crack in the captain's certainty, a hairline fracture caused by the simple fact that she had responded exactly as an innocent person would. She wasn't over-explaining. She wasn't deflecting. She was being a cooperative professional. She was better at this than Keller was. She was better than any of them. The interviews began at 07:15. Keller conducted them personally inside his container unit, one by one. The air conditioning hummed a low, discordant note as Marcus took his seat for the 3rd interview of the morning. He sat across from Keller and told the captain exactly what he had said the day before. He didn't blink. He didn't stutter. And then he leaned forward. "I think you should know about my conversation with Sergeant Princess," Marcus said. Keller's face did the thing Marcus had been watching for, a specific minute tightening around the corners of his eyes. It was the look of a man hearing the one thing he had been dreading in the dark. "Princess told you about the operation?" "Yes, sir, and you believe him." "I believe the operational records he referenced, sir. And I believe what I heard through the wall of the medical tent last night." Keller went very still. He looked at his desk, then at his hands, then at the satellite image pinned to the wall, a wide desert grid that showed everything except the rot inside the camp. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "she's not going to stop. She's been building this for 3 years. Every death in this camp hasn't just been a killing, it's been a chapter in a report that's already being written." Keller looked up, his face pale in the harsh LED light. "You're asking me to sign my own career death warrant. I'm asking you to sign a piece of paper that's already been written by someone else," Marcus said. "The question isn't whether the record exists. It does. The journalist has it. The question is whether your name on that record comes from you, an admission of a mistake made under pressure, or whether it comes from the investigation that follows your arrest." Keller stared at him, and Marcus saw the moment the captain realized he wasn't in a negotiation. He was in a cage. "She planned all of it," Keller whispered. "It wasn't a question. It was a realization that bordered on awe. She walked into my unit, planned the destruction of my command, and executed it right under my nose. And I never—" He stopped, pressing his hands flat on the desk until his knuckles turned white. "I never even looked at her." "No, sir," Marcus said. "You didn't." 43 men across the region, Keller said, his voice barely audible. Was that all her? Marcus thought about the radio transmission he'd intercepted. *3 confirmed. Timeline holding. I don't know, he said. But I think the question of how many is less urgent right now than what happens in the next 24 hours. Keller sat in silence. Outside, the camp was attempting to maintain the facade of normalcy. Marcus could hear the clatter of mess kits, the low rumble of a generator, the sounds of men trying to pretend they weren't waiting for a killer to strike again. Then, Keller did something Marcus hadn't predicted. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a clean sheet of paper and a pen, and began to write. Marcus watched the pen move. Keller wrote with slow, deliberate strokes, his jaw set. There was no hesitation. He didn't cross anything out. He wrote like a man who had been rehearsing this confession in the back of his mind for 3 years and was finally letting the words out. When he finished, he capped the pen with a sharp click and slid the paper across the desk. It was a statement. It was dated, signed, and excruciatingly specific. It named the operation. It named the coordinates. It named the order and the outcome. It listed 14 civilians. It named the entire chain of command, starting with himself. "There's a radio in the medical tent," Marcus said, picking up the paper. "A private channel. The journalist is waiting." Keller nodded once, the short, jerky nod of a man who has just stepped off a ledge and is waiting to hit the ground. "Get Collins," he said. Marcus stood up and opened the door. The desert morning light was blinding, a white-hot glare that seemed to strip the color from the world. He walked across the compound, the confession tucked into his pocket. He thought about the 14 names in the notebook. He thought about the 5 names on the second page. And he wondered if a piece of paper was enough to stop a ghost. He pulled back the flap of the medical tent. Maya was exactly where he had left her, the notebook on her knee. She looked up, and for the first time, Marcus saw something that resembled hope in her eyes. It was a fragile, dangerous thing. He wrote it, Marcus said. She didn't move, she didn't celebrate. She simply held out her hand. Marcus gave her the paper. She read it slowly, her eyes tracking every word, every signature. When she finished, she reached under the cot and pulled out the field radio. She held it with both hands, her knuckles white. "My mother's name was Amara," she said softly. "I want to make sure someone says her name out loud before this is over." "Amara," Marcus repeated. Maya turned on the radio. The static filled the tent, a harsh, rushing sound like a distant ocean. She adjusted the frequency, her fingers moving with practiced ease. On the other end, a voice came through, clear, professional, and alert. "Go ahead," the voice said. "This is Maya Collins," she began. Her voice was a marvel of control. "I have a sworn statement from Captain Ryan Keller regarding Operation Sunfall. I am prepared to transmit the full text, along with the corroborating operational records from the private archive." The transmission lasted 11 minutes. Marcus stood by the tent entrance, acting as a lookout, but his attention was entirely on the woman behind him. She read every name. She read the coordinates. She described the 300-meter discrepancy that had turned a quiet morning into a massacre. She read the names of the children. She read the name of the woman who liked to watch the light change on the hills. On the other end of the line, the journalist only spoke to confirm the data. "Confirmed. Continue." The voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the gravity of the moment through the speaker. This wasn't just a story, it was an ending. When Maya finally clicked off the radio, the silence that followed was absolute. She set the device down on the cot and looked at Marcus. "It's out," she said. "It's out," he confirmed. "That doesn't mean anything changes today," she said, her voice dropping. "The world doesn't stop because of a radio broadcast." "No," Marcus said, "but it means they can't bury it again. It's in the light now." Maya nodded slowly. The expression of hope was still there, but it was shaded by a profound sadness. Marcus understood then that for Maya there was no after. She had defined herself by this mission for so long that she didn't know who she was without the list, and the list still had names on it. At 08:15, the unit gathered one last time. It was a pathetic sight, the remnants of Alpha 7 standing in the center of a camp that felt like it was dissolving into the sand. The heat was a physical weight now, pressing down on their shoulders. Webb looked like a ghost. Prenesse looked like a man waiting for the hangman. Keller stepped forward. He had regained some of his military bearing, his uniform crisp, his posture straight. But his eyes were dead. He looked at his men, the men he had led, the men he had lied to, and the woman who had systematically dismantled his life. "I'm going to say something that I need every person here to hear clearly," Keller began. His voice was different now, stripped of the artificial authority he usually used. This was the voice of a man standing at the end of his rope. "The investigation into the deaths in this unit has produced a result." He paused, his gaze drifting to Maya. She didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, watching the man she had hunted for 3 years. "I have submitted a full confession to an outside agency," Keller said. The silence that followed was more than just an absence of sound. It was a vacuum. Webb's mouth hung open, Prenesse's eyes filled with tears. "I have admitted to the unauthorized targeting of civilians during Operation Sunfall. I have named everyone involved." Keller took a breath, his chest heaving. "The shooter, the person who has been targeting this unit. They weren't an enemy operative, they were a reminder. And I have decided that the reminder is no longer necessary because the truth is finally on the record." He looked at Maya, a silent plea for an end in his eyes. She looked back at him, and for a heartbeat, Marcus thought she might reach for the weapon hidden beneath her jacket. He felt his own heart hammer against his ribs, but Maya Collins didn't move. She simply nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement of a debt finally being paid. Keller turned back to the unit. "Effective immediately, I am surrendering my command. Sergeant Prenesse, you are in charge of the compound until division transport arrives. I will be in my quarters." He turned and walked away, his boots thumping heavily on the dry earth. No one moved. No one spoke. They watched him go, a man walking into his own history. Marcus looked at Maya. She was looking at the hills where the light was now a harsh, unforgiving yellow. She looked smaller somehow, as if the mission had been the only thing keeping her upright. "What now?" Marcus asked. "Now," she said, her voice a whisper, "I go home and see if anything is left of the garden." The drone continued its circuit overhead, its mechanical breathing a constant, fading hum. The sun climbed higher, casting long, jagged shadows across the sand, but for the first time in 3 years, the shadows didn't feel like they were hiding anything. The 14 names were no longer ghosts. They were a record, and in the heart of the desert, that was as close to justice as anyone was ever going to get. Marcus watched her walk toward the medical tent to pack her things. He looked at the remaining men of Alpha 7, standing in the ruins of their own secrets. The war wasn't over, it was never over, but the silence of the camp felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a secret, it was the silence of a long, painful breath finally being released. He looked up at the sky, squinting against the glare. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a printing press was starting to move. Somewhere, a journalist was typing names into a document that the world would read by evening. And somewhere, in a village that didn't exist on any official map, the light was hitting the hills exactly the way a woman named Amara had loved to see it. Marcus Hale took a breath of the hot, dusty air, and for the first time in 5 days, he allowed his eyes to close. The silence that followed Captain Keller's words was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to push the very air out of the lungs of everyone gathered in the heat. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, the brief, terrifying moment of stillness before the earth itself decides to move. Keller stood behind the makeshift podium, his shadow long and jagged against the sun-bleached dust of the compound. He had just admitted that the nightmare they were living was not a random act of insurgent violence, but the delayed harvest of a seed planted 3 years prior. He told them the chain of events leading to this deployment did not begin when they arrived at the camp, but years ago, under his command, and that the responsibility for the deaths they had witnessed belonged, substantially, to the decisions made by this leadership. Webb stood among the men, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he had aged a decade in the last 5 days. He broke the silence first, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the vastness of the desert morning. He told the captain that he wasn't going to explain further right then, but he wanted every person in the unit to know that a full accounting of those decisions was being prepared. It would be submitted through the appropriate channels. Whatever happened in the next 24 hours, that accounting existed. It was in the system. It could not be retracted. It was a digital ghost that would haunt the military record forever. Prentice turned his gaze to Marcus, looking for some sign of what this meant, but Marcus didn't look back. Marcus was focused entirely on Maya Collins. He watched her with the intensity of a predator tracking movement in the tall grass. Her hands moved just a fraction of an inch from her sides, a small, aborted gesture as if she had started to reach for something and then forced herself to stop. Her face was a mask of controlled chaos. It was the same look he had seen in the medical tent when he told her about Keller's statement, a profound internal shift that was too massive for the surface to contain. You could see the edges of it, the hairline fractures in her composure, the way her eyes seemed to be looking at something miles away and years in the past. Rahia was the next to speak, his voice hard. He asked the captain if this meant the killings were connected to a prior operation. He wanted to know if the person hunting them down had a reason. Keller met the gaze without flinching and told them that context existed and that the context was being addressed. The word addressed hung in the air like a foul odor. Reyes repeated it, the word coming out with a weight that made it clear he found it utterly inadequate. 4 people were dead, he reminded the captain. Addressing context wouldn't bring them back. Keller acknowledged this with a grim finality. It wouldn't. Reyes looked away then, his face contorting into an expression of grief that had just been given a frame. Grief without a frame is a wild, unpredictable thing. But once you give it a reason, once you give it a target and a history, it becomes real in a different, more permanent way. It becomes a weight you have to carry instead of a storm you have to weather. Hutchkins remained silent, his eyes fixed on the dirt between his boots. Webb, however, was shivering despite the rising temperature. He stood with his arms wrapped tightly across his chest, his hands gripping his own shoulders as if he were trying to keep himself from falling apart. He asked the question everyone was thinking but was too afraid to voice. Were they the targets? Were the remaining people in the unit on a list? Keller met his eyes. He told them that it was a possibility they were taking seriously. Webb pressed him, demanding to know who was next, but Keller shut it down. He said again that they were taking it seriously, using a tone that closed the door on the conversation without providing a single answer. Marcus never took his eyes off Maya. He watched her as Webb's voice broke on the word list. He saw something move across her features, not quite softness, not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to both. It was the look of someone confronting the human dimension of a decision they had held in the abstract for far too long. To her, these names had been tactical objectives, pieces on a board that represented a debt to be paid. But standing there in the heat, looking at Webb, the abstraction was starting to feel less real than the actual person it applied to. Webb was only 28 years old. He had been 23 when he relayed the coordinates that changed everything. Now he was standing in the morning sun with dark circles under his eyes, his body language screaming for a protection that wasn't coming. For the first time since Marcus had started studying her, Maya Collins looked genuinely conflicted. The ice in her gaze didn't melt, but it cracked. When the assembly disbanded, the soldiers drifted away like ghosts. Marcus tried to move toward Maya, but she was already walking toward the medical tent. There was a specific quality to her pace, a drive, a need for solitude that told him to let her go. He sensed she was undergoing an internal recalibration. The human reality of Webb was replacing the operational abstraction of his name on a list, and she needed space to decide what that meant for her mission. Instead of following her, Marcus went to find Prentice. He found him by the equipment storage on the west side of the camp. Prentice wasn't doing anything. He was just leaning against the corrugated metal wall, staring into the middle distance. Marcus told him that the briefing was over, and Prentice acknowledged he'd heard it. Marcus then dropped the real news. Keller had put his name on a statement, a real one. It had been transmitted 20 minutes prior. Prentice closed his eyes and kept them closed for a long time. When he finally opened them, they were wet. He didn't try to hide it. He asked how Marcus had managed to get Keller to sign such a thing. Marcus told him that in a world where the alternative is worse, men like Keller make those choices. He explained that someone had laid the groundwork very carefully over 3 years to ensure Keller understood exactly how much worse it could get. Prentice looked toward the medical tent, though it was hidden behind the storage containers. He realized then that the deaths, the fear, the entire nightmare had been orchestrated to get that statement. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man finishing a complex calculation. The killing was the pressure, Marcus confirmed. The record was the point. The weight of the realization hit Prentice hard. He pressed his hands flat against the wall behind him, as if he needed the physical support to stay upright. He wondered how long she had been planning it. Marcus told him she had been at it long enough to anticipate every file review, every timeline, and every redirect. She had built a fortress of alibis before they even landed. And the 43 deaths across the region. Marcus didn't have all the answers, but he suspected some of them were connected to other operations, other villages, and other orders signed by other men. The silence that followed was heavy with the physical compression of the truth. Marcus needed one last thing from Prentice. He asked him what Webb had actually done. Prentice was quiet for a moment, the memories clearly painful. He explained that Webb was the runner. He was the one who carried the coordinate confirmation from Keller down to the strike team. He could have questioned the numbers. He could have asked for verification. But he was 23 and he just followed the order. Afterward, he went on leave and never spoke of it again. But a man doesn't forget a thing like that. It lives in the marrow of his bones. Marcus thought back to Webb's shaking hands. The man knew what he had done, and he had been waiting for the universe to come back and collect the debt. They all had. They just hadn't known what form the collection would take. At 9:40 in the morning, the form changed. Marcus was crossing the central compound when the air was split by the sound of raised voices coming from Keller's container unit. There was a sharp impact, the sound of something breaking, and then a sudden, jarring silence. Marcus didn't hesitate. He ran. He covered the 40 yards in seconds and hit the door so hard the entire frame rattled. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Keller was standing behind his desk, his face a mask of command. Webb was on the other side, one hand on the desk, the other balled into a white-knuckled fist. On the floor between them lay the shattered remains of a ceramic mug that had clearly been thrown against the wall with significant force. Webb's face was the face of a man who had finally reached the other side of a long, dark tunnel. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw working as he tried to find the words. He looked like someone who had been holding a dam together with his bare hands for 5 years, only to realize the water had already won. He told Marcus that Keller had finally told him the truth about the operation and the village. Webb's voice was rough, like gravel. He spoke about carrying those coordinates, handing them off, and never asking a single question. He thought that following orders was the same thing as doing the right thing. The room was so quiet Marcus could hear the distant hum of the camp's generators. Webb looked at the floor and whispered that it wasn't the same thing. Not at all. 14 people were dead because of the paper he carried. Marcus tried to say something to offer some kind of comfort, but Webb cut him off. He told Marcus not to tell him it wasn't his fault, or that he was young, or that he was just a cog in the machine. He knew all the excuses, but he also knew what he had done. Marcus looked at Keller then. The captain was watching Webb with an expression that was the most honest thing Marcus had seen on the man's face since the mission began. There was no authority there, no calculation. It was just a man looking at the consequence of his own handiwork and watching it breathe. Marcus informed Webb that the statement had been transmitted to a journalist with the full record. It couldn't be buried now. Webb asked what that meant for them. Marcus told him it meant the system would have to respond. How it responded wasn't something they could control, but the record existed, and the 14 names were finally in it. And the person killing their people, Marcus held his gaze. She was trying to make sure those names mattered. Webb didn't respond. He simply ran out of whatever was holding him upright and sat down on the floor. He leaned his back against the desk, pulled his knees up, and buried his head in his hands. Keller looked at him, then at Marcus. In that look, Marcus saw that Keller finally understood the full, terrifying architecture of the trap that had been built around him. "She's going to finish the list," Keller said, his voice devoid of emotion. Marcus told him he didn't know. He had made a deal, given her a window of time. What she did with that window was her decision. Keller moved toward the door, but Marcus stepped in front of him. He wasn't being aggressive, just deliberate. He told Keller that if he confronted her now, in the middle of the compound without a plan, he would not survive. He warned the captain that Maya Collins was not just one person. She was a force of nature, a thunderstorm condensed into a human shape. Keller stared at him, the weight of his rank clashing with the reality of his vulnerability. He finally stepped back, and Marcus went out into the heat. He crossed the compound and headed for the medical tent, but when he pulled back the flap, it was empty. The silence inside the tent was haunting. The cots were empty, the equipment table bare. The field radio remained, but the notebook was gone. The medical kit was gone. Most importantly, the specific components of her gear, the pieces that could be assembled into a precision weapon, were also gone. She was on the move. Marcus left the tent and scanned the compound. His eyes immediately went to the northern perimeter. The observation post there was currently unmanned due to the schedule shifts after Whitfield's death. Maya would know that. She knew the rhythm of the camp better than the men who lived in it. He moved quickly, but he didn't run. Running attracted attention, and attention brought chaos. He needed to be surgical. He rounded the equipment storage and saw her. She wasn't in the observation post. She was standing 20 feet from it on the interior side of the fence. She wasn't assembling a weapon. She was just standing there, perfectly still, looking out at the desert through the chain link. Marcus stopped 6 feet behind her. "Collins," he said. She didn't turn. He told her that Keller had called for extraction 20 minutes ago. He'd heard it on the unit channel. She turned then, and her face had changed again. The conflict Marcus had seen earlier was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, and much older. She noted that he signed the statement and then immediately called for a helicopter. Marcus realized the truth as he said it. Keller was running. He thought signing the paper was enough to buy his way out. Maya's voice was quiet and level as she spoke. She described the way the system worked. The journalist publishes the story. The military issues a response saying they are conducting an internal review, and then 6 months later, nothing has changed. A year later, it's forgotten. 3 years later, another order is signed, and another 14 people die. She looked at Marcus with a piercing intensity. "You know, that's what happens," she said. Marcus didn't answer because he knew she was right. He had seen the mechanism of the machine at work too many times to pretend otherwise. She asked how long until the helicopter arrived. Marcus estimated 30 minutes, maybe less. She looked back at the sky, a vast expanse of indifferent blue. She told him that Keller was last on her list for a reason. She wanted him to know everything first. She wanted him to spend his final hours carrying the full weight of what he had done. Marcus told her that Keller was indeed carrying it, that he had seen him write the statement. And then he called a helicopter, she whispered. The silence returned, stretching out between them. The desert offered no wisdom and the fence offered no barrier. Marcus asked her to step aside, but she looked at him with something that resembled respect. She told him he couldn't stop this. Marcus stood his ground. He told her he could stand right there and make sure she did whatever she was going to do with full knowledge. He told her he was a person standing in front of her, asking her not to do it. He told her he knew her mother's name. He knew she was Amara. He knew she used to get up before dawn to watch the light change on the hills. Maya Collins went very still. Marcus continued, telling her that Amara was in the record now. Her name, her age, her life. It was all in a document that had been transmitted and could never be erased. He didn't move toward her. He just stayed there, a witness to her pain. He asked her to let the record be the thing that carried her mother forward, not a bullet. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. In the distance, Marcus could hear the ordinary sounds of the camp, voices, the mechanical drone of equipment, and then faintly the sound of rotor blades. A helicopter was approaching, moving fast. Maya looked at the sky. Her face moved through a dozen different emotions at once, too layered and too fast for Marcus to track. He didn't speak, he let her process it. The sound of the helicopter grew louder. "If I let him go," she said, "the system wins." Marcus countered that if she took the shot, the story would become about her, not the village. It would be about the ghost sniper and the impossible kill. The 14 names would be buried inside that sensational narrative, just as they had been buried 3 years ago. The statement had to be the story. Maya looked at the sky one last time. The helicopter was a dark speck against the blue, dropping toward the landing zone on the southern side of the camp. She stood in the wind for a moment, her hair whipping around her face, and then she turned. She walked past Marcus without a word, heading back toward the compound. She didn't look at the helicopter. She didn't look at the landing zone. Marcus watched her go, feeling a massive weight lift from his chest. It wasn't quite relief, but it was something close to it. He had stood in the gap between two opposing forces and hadn't been crushed. He turned and started walking toward the landing zone. He was halfway there when the world changed again. He didn't hear a gunshot. He never heard a gunshot from her weapon. He just heard the ordinary sounds of the morning, the wind, the rotors, the camp, and then the shouting. It was the specific, chaotic shouting of a helicopter crew responding to a crisis. Marcus stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the compound and listened to the screams, and in that moment he understood with devastating clarity that Maya had not gone back to her tent. She had gone to a second position, one she had chosen days ago. He ran, he rounded the final equipment block, and the landing zone opened up before him. Captain Ryan Keller was on the ground. The helicopter was untouched, its crew huddled behind it in a defensive posture, though there was no visible enemy to fire back at. Keller was on his back, his face toward the sky. He looked surprised, not by pain, but by the sudden absence of existence. The shot had come from nowhere and everywhere. It had come from inside the perimeter, from an angle Marcus hadn't even considered because he'd been too busy believing that his words had made a difference. Marcus knelt beside the captain. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't call for a medic. He knew it was over. He realized that Maya had let him be there at the fence. She had let him speak her mother's name. She had let him believe he was winning, all while she was already moving toward the kill. She had spent 3 years becoming invisible so that she could finally be seen. She had destroyed this command with the patience of a saint and the precision of an assassin. Marcus knelt in the dust and looked at the sky, thinking about a woman who was already dissolving back into the silence. The ghost sniper hadn't been out in the desert. She had been inside the wire the whole time. And now she was gone, leaving behind only the undeniable fact of her justice and the names of the dead hanging in the hot, still air. Marcus Hale stayed where he was, watching the desert that gave nothing back, while the radio crackled with the voices of a world that was about to have a lot of questions he couldn't answer. Somewhere out there, a woman was walking away from the last name on a list, and Marcus didn't know what would happen next, or if the truth would ever be enough. The message hit the world outside the desert with the force of a long-delayed landslide. It wasn't just a signal or a string of data. It was a rupture in a carefully maintained silence. As the journalist published and the military responded, the machinery of accountability, slow, grinding, imperfect, and terrifyingly real, began its first sluggish rotations. Marcus Hale stood in the center of that desert, watching the dust settle, and realized he only knew 2 things with any absolute certainty. Amara's name was finally in the record, and Maya Collins was still out there, moving through the world like a ghost that had finally found its purpose. Marcus did not move from beside Keller's body for a long time. He didn't pace, and he didn't call for help. He wasn't in shock, or at least not the kind of shock that paralyzed the mind. He had passed through that particular gateway somewhere around the second day, right when Brooks had turned up dead inside the wire, and the word impossible had stopped meaning anything useful. He stayed there because standing up felt like an admission of finality. To stand up was to accept the brutal reality of what had just happened, and accepting it meant processing it. Processing it meant deciding exactly what he was going to say when the people with the radios, the clipboards, and the specific, hollow institutional energy of a cover story in progress arrived to start asking their questions. He estimated he had approximately 20 minutes before the world came crashing back into this isolated patch of sand. He used every second of them. He thought about everything Maya had told him, the weight of her words more substantial now that she was gone. He thought about the transmission, the journalist waiting on the other end of the line, and the statement in Keller's frantic handwriting that was already tucked away on a server the military did not control and could not reach. He thought about what Keller's death changed, and more importantly, what it did not change. The statement had been transmitted. The record existed. Those facts were immovable, pillars of truth left standing in the wake of a storm, regardless of whether the man who signed the statement was alive to defend his signature or not. In some ways, and this was a thought that would settle in Marcus's gut like lead, causing him guilt for years to come, Keller's death actually made the statement harder for the system to dismiss. A living Keller was a liability. A living Keller could recant, could claim he was coerced at gunpoint, or could deploy a legion of high-priced military lawyers to contest the circumstances of his signature. But a dead Keller was a document. He was a fixed point in a chain of evidence that the journalist could build a case around without the primary subject undermining the foundation from the inside. Maya had known that too. Of course she had. She had calculated the value of his life against the value of his confession and found the latter to be the only thing worth keeping. Marcus finally stood up, his joints protesting the stillness. He looked at the desert in every direction, squinting against the rising glare of the sun. He looked for movement, for a plume of dust, for any indication of which way she had gone. There was nothing but the shimmering heat and the endless, shifting dunes. The desert remained exactly what it had always been, indifferent, absolute, and enormously patient. It was the kind of patience that only things which exist outside of time can truly possess. The helicopter crew was still active on the radio. Even from several yards away, Marcus could hear the specific, clipped language of people reporting an incident to those above them. It was a verbal chain of custody, the language growing more careful and more sterile with every upward transfer. By the time the news reached the level where actual decisions were made, it would sound almost nothing like the bloody, desperate reality of what had occurred on this landing zone. It would be sanitized, scrubbed of its humanity, and turned into a series of logistical anomalies. Marcus turned and walked back toward the compound. Apprentice was standing at the edge of the landing zone area. He had clearly heard the shouting and the finality of the shot, and he had come running only to stop short. He stood there with the expression of a man who had reached the final page of a book he had been reading for 3 years, only to discover that the conclusion felt nothing like he had expected. It wasn't a triumph. It was a hollow, echoing silence. "Keller?" Apprentice asked. It wasn't really a question. The answer was written in the way Marcus carried his shoulders. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice sounding brittle in the dry air. Apprentice looked at the ground. He stared at the dirt for a long time, his shadow stretching out toward the body he couldn't bring himself to look at. Then he spoke, his voice low. "She took the shot. Even after you tried to stop it, she took the shot from a position she had already set before I even talked to her at the fence." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face him. He stood directly in front of Apprentice and said it plainly, because at this point the truth was the only currency they had left. "I thought I was standing between her and the landing zone. I thought I was the shield. But I was standing exactly where she needed me to stand so she could use the other position without me being in a place to see it. I wasn't protecting anyone. I was a distraction." Apprentice absorbed that, his eyes narrowing as he worked through the geometry of the betrayal. "She used you." "She gave me the chance to try," Marcus countered. "There's a difference. She let me make the argument. She let me say the name out loud. And then she did what she had already decided to do before the argument even started. So nothing you said changed anything? Apprentice asked. Marcus thought about that carefully. He had learned in 5 harrowing days to weigh every conclusion before accepting it as fact. I don't know, he said. The list had 4 names left when I walked into that tent this morning. Keller is the only one she took. Apprentice, Webb, Reyes, Hutchkins. She walked away from 4 names. Apprentice went very still. The air between them seemed to thicken. 4 names that are connected to the operation, Marcus continued, the words heavy. 4 names that were on that list in that notebook, and she walked away from all of them. The silence that followed carried the full weight of that realization. It was a reprieve they hadn't asked for and didn't know if they deserved. The statement? Apprentice finally asked, his voice unsteady for the first time since Marcus had known him. She let the statement be enough for the 4 of us, I think, but not for Keller. Keller called the helicopter, Marcus said. Keller signed the paper and then tried to run, and she had already calculated that he would. She had already decided what her response would be to that specific choice. Apprentice pressed his hands over his face, hiding his eyes. He held them there for a long time, his breathing ragged. When he finally lowered them, his eyes were wet and his jaw was set. The expression beneath the grief and the fear was something Marcus recognized. It was the look of a man finally arriving at a reckoning he had seen coming for years, finding that the arrival was both worse and more clarifying than the long, agonizing wait. I have to tell the truth, Apprentice said. Everything. All of it. Not to a radio transmission or an anonymous record. I need to say it in person to whoever has the actual authority to act on it. Yes, Marcus said. That ends my career, Apprentice noted, though there was no hesitation in his voice. Yes, and possibly puts me in a courtroom. Possibly. Apprentice nodded slowly, then with more conviction. Then that's what happens. He looked at Marcus with the clear, steady gaze of a man who had just made a decision that simplified his entire life by making it infinitely harder. You're going to back me up. Every word, Marcus promised. They looked at each other across the compound in the escalating morning heat. They had arrived at this desert as part of a unit, a cohesive element of a vast military machine. They were leaving it as something that had no military classification. They were witnesses. They were witnesses to the killing, the planning, the transmission, and the statement. They were witnesses to the name of a girl said out loud before dawn. The investigation team arrived at 11:40. It was a clinical arrival. 2 vehicles, 6 people, and the specific institutional composure of military investigators who had been told something significant had happened, but hadn't yet been told exactly how deep the rot went. They set up their base of operations in Keller's container unit. Marcus found that appropriate in a dark way, though he didn't share the thought with anyone. The lead investigator was a woman named Colonel Patricia Dine. She had the weary, focused manner of someone who had spent 20 years separating what actually happened from what people needed to have happen. Over those 2 decades, she had developed a tolerance for complexity that most investigators in her position eventually traded for easy answers. She was 62 years old, and she had the eyes of a person who read people rather than situations. She interviewed Marcus first. That choice told him everything he needed to know about her instincts. She had already identified him as the person most likely to have the fullest picture of the chaos. He sat across from her in the cramped, metallic heat of Keller's unit and told her everything. He started with the shadow on the canvas wall on the second night and moved through the radio transmission, the conversation with Apprentice, the notebook, and the 2 lists. He told her about the medical tent before dawn, the way the light had hit Maya Collins's face when she spoke about Amara and the journalist. He told her about standing at the northern fence, making an argument for mercy, and believing for 8 minutes that he had actually won. Colonel Dine listened to the entire odyssey without interrupting once. She took notes in a small, weathered notebook with a pen that moved in quick, precise strokes. When he finally finished, she looked at her notes for a long beat and then looked him directly in the eye. The journalist, she said, you believe the transmission was successful? I have no reason to believe otherwise, Marcus replied. And Keller's written statement, you watched him write it. I was in the room. Did he appear coerced? Marcus met her gaze and didn't blink. He appeared like a man who had finally decided to stop lying. Dine watched him for a moment, searching for a crack in his conviction. Finding none, she wrote something else in her notebook and shifted gears. What can you tell me about Collins's current location? Nothing, Marcus said. She's gone. She was gone before the helicopter crew was even off the radio, direction unknown. She knows this terrain better than any of us. She's been studying it since long before we arrived. Physical description. Distinguishing features. It's in her service file, Marcus said, then he paused, weighing his next words. Or rather, it's in the file that exists in the system under that name. I'd recommend cross-referencing it against every field medic rotation in this region for the past 3 years. You'll find gaps. You'll find places where the records look clean, but the personnel don't match the institutional memory of the units involved. She's been a ghost in your machine for a long time, Colonel. Dine looked at him with an expression that was as close to approval as a woman in her position could allow. You've been thinking about this. I've had time, Marcus said. One more question, she said, setting her pen down on the table. In your assessment, and I'm asking for your honest assessment, not your official one, was she justified? The question sat between them in the small metal room, heavy and suffocating. Marcus thought about Rower and Brooks and Jensen and Whitfield. 4 men dead in 4 days by a weapon that left no trace. He thought about Keller face down on the landing zone. He thought about Amara, buried in the sand 300 meters away, and the date 3 years ago that the official record claimed had 0 civilian casualties. He thought about the 43 deaths across the region and how many of those had been connected to operations exactly like the one apprentice had described. He thought about what it meant that the system had produced a person willing and capable of this level of response, and what that said about the gap between what the system claimed to be and what it actually was. I think, Marcus said carefully, that she did what she believed was the only thing left to do after every other option had been removed by the people in this room and rooms like it. Whether that constitutes justification is a question I'm not qualified to answer. That's for the record to decide. Dine picked up her pen again. That, she said, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in this room today. When Marcus finally went outside, the heat was at its peak. He found Webb sitting on the ground near the equipment storage, his back against the corrugated metal wall and his knees pulled up to his chest. It was the same broken posture he had been in on Keller's floor. Marcus sat down beside him because there was no good reason not to. They were both survivors of a storm they had helped create. They sat in silence for a while, watching the investigative team move around the camp with the purposeful, rhythmic efficiency of people building a picture from the wreckage. She could have killed me, Webb said finally. The words came out flat and factual. It was the way people spoke when they had been sitting with a thought so long that the emotion had been bleached out of it, even if the pain was still humming beneath the surface. Yes, Marcus said. She didn't. No, why not? It wasn't quite a question. It was the sound of a man working through a puzzle that refused to resolve into a clean answer. I think, Marcus said slowly, that she made a distinction between the people who made the decisions and the people who simply carried them out. And I think somewhere in the 24 hours between the briefing and the final shot, that distinction shifted for at least some of the names on her list. I carried the coordinates, Webb said, his voice cracking. I know what I did. I'm not looking for absolution. I don't want you to tell me it wasn't my fault. I know you don't, Marcus said. Then why am I still alive? Marcus thought about Maya's face during the assembly, the way her expression had flickered when Webb's voice broke on the word list. He thought about the thing he had seen move across her features in that moment. It wasn't softness, and it wasn't exactly sympathy, but it was something adjacent to both. It was the human dimension breaking through the operational abstraction she had lived in for years. I think she saw you carrying it, Marcus said. And I think she decided that a person who has been carrying that weight for 5 years without putting it down is already in a kind of accounting. She saw more use in you carrying that weight forward, telling the truth on the record, than in simply removing you from the equation. Webb was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the dunes. That's a mercy I didn't earn, he whispered. Maybe that's what mercy is, Marcus said. It isn't about what you earn, it's about what you do with the time you have left. Webb looked at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. I'm going to tell them everything, every detail I remember from that day, every coordinate, every name. I'm going to put it in writing and sign it, and I'm going to do it every single time someone asks until the record is finally correct. Good, Marcus said. It won't bring them back, Webb added, his voice hollow. No, it won't. But their names will be in the record. The record will exist, and that's more than they had 6 days ago. Webb nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. He didn't say anything else, and neither did Marcus. They sat against that wall in the punishing heat and let the silence do its work. Silence, when it is honest, can hold things that words are simply too small for. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Colonel Dine found Marcus near the northern fence. It was the same spot where he had stood with Meyer only hours before, though it felt like a lifetime had passed. Dine told him that the preliminary findings were already supporting a full-scale investigation into the operational records connected to the deployment. She also mentioned that the journalist's material had already been flagged by Division as a significant evidentiary concern. In the language of the institution, that meant it had become too loud to ignore and too public to suppress without creating a catastrophic scandal. The statement? Marcus asked. Our statement is being treated as a primary document, Dine said. Whatever Keller's intentions were when he signed it, the document is legally and operationally significant. And the 14 names? She paused, looking out at the desert. They will be added to the official record of the operation with the correct coordinates and the correct casualty classifications. Marcus let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since he first saw the shadow on the tent wall. It won't be fast, Dine warned him. The process will take months, maybe years. There will be resistance at every level of the command structure. I won't pretend otherwise, but it will happen. She said it with a certainty that wasn't performative. It was the voice of a woman who knew the difference between a process designed to be buried and a process that had been made too visible to hide. There's one more thing, Marcus said. He had been debating whether to say this since the morning, and he had finally decided that the truth required the full picture. Collins, Dine said, prompting him. She built a parallel record over 3 years, Marcus explained. Radio transmissions, copies of operational logs, everything. The journalist has all of it. And I don't think it's just about the operation here. I think there are other villages, other unreported strikes, other chains of command in that file. Dine's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. It was the look of a person receiving information that expanded the scope of a problem from a local failure to a systemic collapse. How many other operations? I don't know, Marcus admitted. But if 43 people died across this region and the investigation kept finding no external shooter, no shell casings, and no trace, and if those deaths followed a specific pattern connected to specific records, then the answer is probably a very large number. Dine was quiet, the wind whipping her hair across her face. You understand what you're asking me to open. I understand what's already open, Marcus said. I'm just asking you to have the courage to look at it directly. She looked at him for a long time, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Then she spoke. Write it all down, every word, everything you saw, everything you heard, every name she mentioned, every detail of her movements. I want it on my desk before your debrief tomorrow morning. Yes, ma'am. As she walked away, Marcus turned back toward the fence. The afternoon light was different now. It was harsher, more direct, lacking the soft quality of possibility that the morning light had carried. This was the light of things already decided, of consequences set in motion. He thought about what Dine had said. It will happen. He thought about the machinery, slow, grinding, and real. He wondered if Maya had been right to bypass it, or if he was right to trust it now. He arrived at the same conclusion he always reached when he thought about her. She was both right and wrong simultaneously, in a way that didn't resolve and wasn't supposed to. She was right that the system was built to bury its mistakes. She was wrong that the burial was always permanent. She was right that justice required pressure, but he hoped she was wrong that the only pressure that worked was the kind that left bodies in its wake. Or perhaps, he mused, the machinery was only moving now because she had forced its hand. Maybe the transmission existed only because the deaths made the situation impossible to ignore. Maybe Keller had only signed the paper because Maya had made the alternative untenable. Maybe the record was being corrected only because 4 soldiers were dead inside a secure perimeter, and the system had been forced to look inward because it could find no enemy to blame on the outside. He didn't know the answer. He suspected he would spend the rest of his life not knowing. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale sat in a sterile debriefing room in a building that was 1,000 miles away from the desert. It was a place of air conditioning and fluorescent lights, staffed by people with the careful, practiced composure of those who work at the heart of the machine. He sat across a table from 2 officers and answered their questions for 6 hours. He signed his name to a document 43 pages long that contained, among many other things, the names of 14 civilians and the true coordinates of a strike from 3 years prior. He signed it knowing he was now a part of a process he could no longer control, a process that was agonizingly slow but undeniably real. Apprentice had testified before him. Webb had testified after him. Their statements were consistent in every material detail. That is what happens when people tell the truth. The details line up not because they have been coordinated, but because the truth has a specific, immutable shape that multiple people can independently recognize. The journalist published the story 6 weeks after the camp was decommissioned. It ran in 3 countries simultaneously. The headline in the primary publication identified the 14 names, including one that had never appeared in any official record before that day: Amara. The military's official response, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of institutional language. It was constructed to convey accountability while minimizing damage. It stated that the operational records had contained administrative errors, that the appropriate corrections were being made, and that the chain of command responsible for the authorization had been identified for appropriate action. It was inadequate. It was also a victory. Marcus read the report and held both of those truths in his mind at once, deciding that was the only honest way to live. 6 months after the desert, Marcus was reassigned. A new unit, a new region, the ordinary continuation of a career that had been forever complicated by what he had witnessed. On his first day, his new commanding officer called him into her office. She was a woman he didn't know, someone whose name had never been on any list. She looked at his file and then looked at him. "Your record indicates you're the kind of person who notices things other people miss," she said. "In my experience, that's either an asset or a liability depending on the day." "I've been told it's both," Marcus replied. She nodded. "Good answer. Get to work." Marcus carried what he had seen the way Apprentice had described carrying the operation. It wasn't a weight separate from him. It had become structural. It was part of the way he stood, the way he moved, and the way he looked at the world. He carried Amara's name. He carried the image of a shadow on a canvas wall and a woman's hands working with lethal precision in the dark. He carried the memory of Maya Collins's face in the last moment he saw her, walking away from the landing zone, her hands at her sides, her pace unhurried. She had the absolute composure of a person who had done everything they came to do and was ready for whatever the world threw at her next. He didn't know where she was. He didn't ask. He didn't file any reports speculating on her location. He told Dine the truth. He had no information. This was a choice as much as a fact, and he made it fully aware of the implications. 8 months after the camp, a news report crossed his desk. A man whose name Marcus recognized, a man who had been part of the operational chain of command for the original strike and had retired 2 years prior, was found dead. He had been living quietly in a city Marcus had never visited. The local police classified it as a single gunshot wound from an unknown location. No shell casings were recovered. There were no witnesses. There was no suspect. Marcus read the report twice. He set it down, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and a small piece of paper. He wrote one name, Amara. He looked at the name until the ink seemed to etch itself into his vision. Then he folded the paper, tucked it into his pocket, and went back to work. He moved through a world that was not clean, a world that had never been clean, but he moved with the deliberate choice to push towards something better. He knew the pushing was slow. He knew it was often painful. But he knew, finally, that it was real. The military had searched the horizon for miles with every instrument in their arsenal. They had used satellites, drones, and ground teams for weeks after the camp was abandoned. They found nothing. No trace of a campsite, no discarded equipment, no evidence of a shooter who had operated from outside the wire. They found nothing because the ghost sniper had never been outside. She had been embedded in the system itself, hiding in its schedules, its blind spots, and its arrogant certainty that the enemy was always someone else, somewhere else. She had understood that the most dangerous position wasn't the one farthest from the target, but the one closest to the truth. She had been among them from the beginning, and she was still out there now, moving through the shadows of the world she had helped unmask. The desert had not given her back. The desert never does. It only keeps the secrets of those who know how to listen to its silence.